Hello and welcome back to our regular Sunday history series, looking at the history of what we in the West euphemistically call the Silk Road. So that's kind of the history of the economic, trading and political relationships between West and East. But in actual fact, to look at the economic nervous system of the world and how it comes into being, you have to go back a lot further than West and East, because that's a boundary that only really exists from about the 1st century. Now, we looked at the establishment of a political engine in the Jordan Valley that you can see the ruins of at Petra in the modern day country of Jordan. And we talked about the formation of this political engine as coming from kind of the disintegration of a Mesopotamian dynasty, the 3rd dynasty of Ur, represented in the biblical stories of Noah and his children. And then last week we looked at the establishment of an economic centre around what we call Nubia and the emergence of Egyptian civilization. And we looked at the kind of period that we call the Bronze Age collapse, and we looked at one of the kind of key causes being the Egyptian subordination of the vassals and the different territories that came under their power, and how this resulted in the consolidation of this political engine, where there's a tribal federation, where there was a sacred complex and a harem function with lots of powerful women from multiple civilizations. And we talked about how that consolidated here as a result of that kind of failure of Egyptian civilization. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the Mediterranean and we're going to go back to what we called the steppes. So in the first video, I explained that if you look at a world map, there is a strip of land that will be on the map between Europe and China, which we divided into two, the Western and the Eastern steppe. And that this steppe kind of contains like lots of people kind of emerge, almost all the civilizations that are connected to this landmass emerge kind of from here in one way or the other. And we talked about the way it's punctuated by mountain ranges, and that these mountain ranges actually were the site of kind of Neolithic belief systems with high priestesses at their core, which acted as kind of a supranational kind of institution, a proto-UN, where divine authority for kingship would be associated with these priestesses way back to Neolithic China, then in Mesopotamia, and at the core of the pharaoh system with the gods' wives in Egypt. Now today we're going to go back to looking at the steppe, and we're going to say we started looking at the people coming down from the Armenian plateau to form the basis of Mesopotamian civilization. We're going to look at the steppe from the Armenia to the coast, Macedon, Mount Olympus, kind of famed for Alexander the Great. And then we're going to look down at the Greek islands, and then we're going to look at a very important mountain gate, which is in modern day Turkey called the Cilician Gate. Now, in the first video I explained that there are two mountain gates to the steppe that were very important in shaping early civilization. The Zingarian Gate in China, which currently acts as a railway corridor between West and East, and the Cilician Gate in modern day Turkey. And this gate was understood to be incredibly significant from the very earliest dawn of history. This is where people would come down from the steppe to get to the Fertile Crescent. Now, we don't know how old civilization was here. There's a town called Catalhoyuk, which is about 7,000 or 8,000 years old, which shares architectural styles with Avaris in Egypt and with kind of ancient Mesopotamia. But the Cilician Gate itself literally was so important that it was connected with mother goddess worship and this high priestess from the dawn of civilization till actually very, very recently. And it was understood to be the key between West and East. Whoever held this gate had a very huge amount of power. Now, so we're looking at, when you come down from this gate, you then you come down, and we're going to look down as far as what would be modern day Aleppo in Syria, where there was a civilization called Ebla. And Ebla, and the oldest town in existence that we know of is Catalhoyuk, which is quite near here. Ebla are incredibly important, and in the remains of kind of the civilization from here, you find Chinese like artifacts that are kind of referencing Chinese religious practices from Neolithic China. So this is very old root. This is very, very important territory. So we're going from Armenia down to what would be modern day Aleppo, up to the Greek islands. And on the Greek islands, the civilization I want to discuss are the Minoans. Now, last week we talked about the Bronze Age collapse, and we talked about it as a civilization changing conflict, and we talked about the fact that civilizations appeared to disappear like just off the face of the earth, and new civilizations appeared, and that this ended Egyptian dominance. We talked about the fact that the stories of Moses and kind of the consolidation of this political endurance at Kadesh, Holy Mountain, and kind of the strip of Canaan, like, this is actually, there is no conflict this big that only has one axis. So World War I, you have to understand multiple axes to understand what happened. And what we're going to talk about today is the other axis in that conflict around the Mediterranean. And in doing so, we're going to show you how the trade routes and maritime routes that would go on to shape Europe and shape all these territories and literally formed the foundation of the economic organization from Britannia right down to Africa, down to the Indus Valley and up to Siberia were formed. This is the very roots of those economic and political systems. In fact, the word for Europe comes from a Phoenician princess. The Phoenicians are the civilization that come out of this, who was said to have married Zeus, and that's literally the name for Europe comes here. Now, we're going to look at a civilization called the Minoans. Now, the Minoans are hands down one of my favourite civilizations to study in the whole of history, not least because their clothes are absolutely fabulous. Now, we didn't know about the Minoans till literally the 20th century. We'd seen references to them in the story of Ariadne in Greek mythology, which can often be kind of a bit misogynistic, I'm going to be honest. Now, up until the 20th century, like much kind of using of biblical texts and mythology was about looking for things that were in these texts. But what the 20th century has given us is kind of archaeological evidence which allows us to actually put these texts in context and use them to illustrate and to get insight into what actually happened. And the story of the Minoans is incredibly important at the beginning of our journey to understanding archaeology, but their artifacts are absolutely fabulous. Now, there are seals and signet rings that are found associated with the Minoans that, like, literally they are so sophisticated that literally the crazy people who talk about ancient aliens, you know, you look at these and you actually kind of understand where they're coming from. There's a seal that's about this big that's got a carved picture of a dancing bull that could be an incredibly sophisticated picture 10 times the size, but it's on a seal this big. On the signet rings from this civilization, you see high priestesses who their costume kind of is reminiscent of that from ancient Mesopotamia. And you see very specifically Jordanian date palms here. So this is linked to this place at Kadesh. Now, because the Minoans are on the Greek islands, we're used to thinking of them as the foundation of Greek civilization. But it's actually a much more complicated than access than that, and they were very much connected to the Near East. And if you look at these islands, they're actually right across from the economic centre that we were discussing last week with Egypt and the Nubia. Now, what we're going to look at today is the other axis in the Bronze Age collapse, so that we can understand how this resulted in the civilizations like the Phoenicians and the Carthaginian Empire, which laid the foundation for kind of the rest of world systems and civilizations. Now, the Minoans are literally one of the islands I want to look at. On the island of Crete, Crete is literally the home, like you can find evidence on Crete of people going back to the Neolithic time. So this is a civilization that emerged over a very long period of time, longer than we can date, I think. And we're having to re-examine the way that we date these civilizations. But the stories that tell you about kind of Minoan civilization are the story of Ariadne in Greek mythology. Now, Ariadne was the daughter of a king, Minos, and this is related to the myth of the Minotaur in the labyrinth. And Minoan there would be literally youths sacrificed to be chased around this labyrinth by this Minotaur, which was like a bull. And what this is kind of a coded story about sacrificial practices. But King Minos, who's Ariadne's father, is also said to be a lawmaker. And the Ariadne story is really important. Now, Ariadne rescues this guy called Theseus by giving him some string when he's threatened with the labyrinth so that he can get out of the labyrinth. And he falls in love with Ariadne and they run off together on a boat. And then he abandons her on the island of Lemnos, where she falls in love with Dionysus. Now, Theseus, I'm not impressed with, but actually the key to this story is this: she falls in love with Dionysus because this is a replication of the motif of the high priestess with the divine consort that we saw with Nuar in China, and we saw in ancient Mesopotamia, and we see at the roots of the god-wife systems. Now, Lemnos itself is an island that's incredibly important, and while the artifacts that we have from this civilization, like from Crete especially, are wonderful, Lemnos is actually really important. Lemnos is intrinsically linked to this gate, the Cilician Gate in Turkey, for a very long time after the period that I'm discussing. Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, has her marriage rights on Lemnos, and this gives her power over the Cilician Gate, which is crucial to understanding the way that Alexander the Great was able to kind of get hold of the territories that he gets hold of. It's that significant. This is like secret mysteries at the core of kind of ancient governance systems for thousands of years. Now, Lemnos contains, there are ruins of an assembly kind of thing where there are steps on each side where people would sit, and this is a point of assembly, and this is also a point where there are ossuaries, lots and lots of ossuaries containing human remains. This is a place where the dead are venerated. But in the mythology of Lemnos, with this kind of Ariadne at its core of its mythology, this is a place where there are no men. This is a centre of governance for women. This is a centre of female power. Now, the island of Lemnos is not the only kind of civilization here. There's also the island of Thera. And this is a very, very important. In the book of Exodus, it talks about the sky going black. And Thera is the site of a volcano, and the eruption of this volcano is incredibly significant in this period. Now, for historians, the eruption of Thera and the loss of Santorini, I mean literally most of this island disappears, is really important because it's an important event for cross-civilization chronology. This is such an important event that actually it can be seen in the rainfall in civilizations, even in South America and in China. And in an age where we're struggling to do cross-civilization dating, this event is an event that binds them. But in terms of the actual event on this region, this event, Thera, is really important. Now, what's kind of interesting about the kind of the evidence we have from Thera is that the evacuation of this island, this volcanic island, seems to have been successful. There are very few human remains here. It doesn't look like, it's not like Pompeii where there are people frozen in, in ashes. And what you have to understand is for this civilization, these women, these high priestesses associated with Minoan civilization, this is going to have been perceived that they literally knew that this was coming. These were women. Do you remember we talked about the first name in the Bible being El Issa, the women that God speaks through? These women were perceived to have a direct line to the gods and have been able to do this. And it seems that there was huge political instability around these women. Now, this is a climate where Babylonian civilization is rising in reaction to these high priestesses. We talked about that kind of a couple of videos ago. But here, this is actually the axis that we're talking about politically, is between these high priestesses and this civilization, the Minoans, and another civilization called the Myceneans. Now, there are two documents that we have that can give us insight into the Bronze Age collapse. One of them is the book of Genesis. Genesis means formation, and it appears to have been a very deliberately written text which gives you details. I showed you how to use it to gain insight into ancient Mesopotamian civilization. It's actually about this period. This event Thera actually appears in the book of Exodus with regard in kind of the run up to kind of the establishment of this political engine at Kadesh. Now, in the books of Genesis, there are descriptions of Sarah, the last high priestess of Ur, and she is the wife of Abraham. And there are stories about her and the king Abimelech, who wants kind of to, I think, marry her, and she asks Abraham to pretend to be her brother. These high priestesses would be married to their brother. This is about asking Abraham to do that. Abraham, when he deals with the Pharaoh, who also wants to be with Sarah, the Pharaoh gives him lots and lots of resources because he's with Sarah. Sarah is the last high priestess of Ur. She is going to have been the most powerful woman that this civilization can contemplate. She is the most senior high priestess connected with Ur itself, even though Ur falls, with power over this mountain gate, the Cilician gate. In the books of Genesis, she is connected with the Hittites, and we're going to talk about Hattusha and the Hittites probably in a bit more detail in the next video. But this high priestess is connected very much with all these mountain bases, and this is also linked to these Minoans. There are Minoan artifacts in Avaris, which is the city that Abraham and Sarah are said to have settled. The Hyksos kings, the friezes which depict them, are very much in the Minoan artistic style. These civilizations are very much connected. Now, the Iliad is a document which comes into being about 700 years later and depicts a woman called Helen of Troy, who is said to be the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, in antiquity, there was a word called comely, which we have interpreted in the modern word as beautiful, but it's actually about spiritual power. Helen of Troy and the woman who's Sarah in the Bible, the last high priestess of Ur, are likely to be the same woman. The most beautiful woman, the most comely woman in the world is actually referring to her. Herodotus depicts Helen going to Egypt, again, which is repeated in the books of Genesis regarding Sarah. Now, it's very likely that in the population movement that Sarah and Abraham represent, they came down from, or down through Armenia, down through the Cilician Gate. And the city of Hattusha is incredibly important in understanding this dynamic. Now, if Hattusha is a city that appears in the Bronze Age connected with a civilization called the Hittites, who we'll discuss. But nearby, there's a monument called Godzillakaya. And if you look on the face of like the rock-cut chambers at Godzillakaya, there are depictions of every god from all these different civilizations who would come together. And actually this was a center where all these civilizations would come together to venerate the mother goddess, who would be above all these other gods. There are also pictures of 12 priests. Now, this mountain gate was so powerful that the priests who worked for the high priestess here had to chop their testicles off. In fact, circumcision is actually like the mark of the Holy Covenant that actually marks the kind of Sarah and Abraham stories in the Bible. Now, in the story, in the Iliad's Homer, it depicts this king Menelaus from this Mycenean civilization. And this Mycenean civilization exists on mainland Greece, and the tensions between them and the Minoans are incredible. The evacuation of Crete, where the Minoans just disappear, which is actually likely to be them kind of coming together within this kind of Bronze Age collapse. Actually, the Myceneans at this point appear to be wanting access to this city. Now, the Mycenean civilization literally disappear and they fall, and there are theories that they actually, a people called the Dorians, kind of who were subordinated by them, are part of an uprising against them. But the story in Iliad's Homer is of Menelaus, this king, and this war being triggered by the fact that this king wants access to this woman. The city of Troy, while there is a city I think that they're calling Troy, it's actually more likely to be Hattusha, which was incredibly important and the Myceneans will have wanted because of its like nearness to the Cilician Gate. This is a strategically important city. The rock-cut chambers with all these gods on the walls, there's a little bomb-shaped pillar which indicates that sacred marriage happened here. At different times of year, like the spring equinox, the high priestess would have been expected to perform sacred marriage with somebody as part of these ceremonies. This is likely what's referred to in the stories of both Abimelech in the Bible and Menelaus. Now, the important part of the Genesis story is not the story of Abimelech, and it's not this aspect. It's actually the relationship between Sarah and Hagar. Now, Hagar is the Pharaoh's daughter. Hagar marries Abraham, and it's perceived that some of Sarah's power will come to her. And what's described within the story of the establishment of this political engine at Kadesh is of the promise at the core of the Abrahamic faith being made to Hagar herself. This is likely to represent the power of Sarah, the high priestess of Ur, coming to this woman, to this political engine, so that they will establish a harem function at this site. Now, the gap between the stories of Sarah and Abraham and the Battle of Kadesh, which is kind of the finale of the Bronze Age collapse, is 400 years. The gap between Hagar and the Bronze Age collapse is 400 years. And by the time you're getting to near the Bronze Age collapse, one of the best resources that we have are the Armani Letters. We talked a little bit about Akhenaten and the literary kind of legacy around the collapse of kind of Egyptian civilization at this point. Now, the Armani Letters are the ones where the word Haribu appears, which is like the precursor of the word Hebrew. And you see mention of this tribal federation forming of all these Egyptian vassal states. The Minoans were tributaries to Egypt. Now, what's important in the Armani Letters is the discussion of the wives. These wives of all these different vassal states and kingdoms that kind of uprise against Egypt, they are based at Kadesh. And what the stories of Sarah and Hagar represent are literally the establishment of the harem function that allows this political development. 400 years between this story that's represented by Sarah in the Bible, or Helen of Troy, and then the Habaru people and the Bronze Age collapse, the Battle of Kadesh, and the stories of Moses. These women are central. And this political engine that forms at Kadesh is about the high priestesses from this Minoan civilization. It's about these powerful women from Egypt, and it's also about this high priestess's power of Ur consolidating at this site, forming the promise to Hagar that still forms the basis of modern Abrahamic faiths. Now, the civilizations that emerged, the Bronze Age collapse is notable because historians used to think that civilizations had just appeared out of nowhere. And this is not the case. This is clearly not the case. And the civilization that emerged to take over the dominance of the territories around the Mediterranean, which were Egyptian, are the Phoenicians. Now, Phoenician means scarlet and purple, and scarlet and purple is referenced throughout biblical texts, and it's the combination of the sacred and the royal. It references the purple morex, the Tyrian purple, which is actually connected with the Minoan civilization. The Phoenician civilization formed the maritime networks that take over Egyptian territories around the Mediterranean. There is a population reorganization at this point. Civilizations like the Nugarit on Sardinia, you see literally the introduction of new political engines with the Phoenicians at their root that are highly sophisticated. And this begins to form the foundation of like a trading network that reaches. The Phoenicians had contact with Britannia. We were a tin source for them. This is literally, they were said to be able to circumnavigate Africa. This was a maritime network, so we have this economic center of the Nubia. We have this political engine on the Levant, and we have this maritime trading network with territories as far as Britannia and West Africa. Now, the Phoenicians are literally pre-money. This is very early civilization. This is triggering Neolithic development and kind of, well, not Neolithic, but you know what I mean, like all over Europe. But the other key component to understand here is the connection to people on the steppe. The Cilician Gate here represents a commercial corridor, allowing trading with people on the steppe itself. In the inscription for Sakiya in Avaris, it describes him bringing the composite bow. This gives him this is technology that's imported from the steppe. This is a new design of bow with sinew in it, so it's much more efficient. And what happens here is the establishment of trading networks through the Cilician Gate, and then we're looking at kind of maritime networks with the Phoenicians, a political engine in the Levant, and an economic center with the Nubia. And this goes on to form, like, literally the nervous system of world economic systems for every civilization afterwards. Now, in the next video, what I'm going to look at is the maturation of the kingdoms kind of shaped by this on the steppe, and I'm going to look at how that develops. I'm going to pay particular attention to kind of modern day Turkey, but kind of the foundations of Greek civilization right up to the modern day, and I'm going to pay particular attention to the Hittites and what they represent. And that's going to be in the next video, which I think I'm going to upload probably round about now when I've finished uploading this one. Thank you very much.